Today's daf is daf Ayin Beis. And just to review what we did here on Ayin Aleph Amid Beis, we had the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said that if you have patches in your field of grains that are growing, and between the patches there are other grains that were cut down, were harvested. And the question now is whether or not we see that harvest of those grains in between the patches that he left standing is considered ktsira. Is it considered a valid ktsira? And if it's the beginning of his ktsira, then the entire field is one entity, and peah can be left in one corner for the entire field. But if, on the other hand, we don't view that ktsira between the patches as a valid ktsira, then it would be a mafsik, and you'd have to leave peah in the corner of every single patch unto itself. And it would seem that Rabbi Akiva distinguishes between the grains, regarding the grains between the patches, whether they reached Hava Shlish, 1/3, or they did not. If it's less than Hava Shlish, then we don't consider that cutting down of the grains as qualifying as a ktsira. And if it doesn't qualify as ktsira, then it sets up a hefsek between each one of the patches, requiring its own hafrashas peah. And here on Daf Ayin Beis, which is today's daf, we have a quote from the Mishnah, which you'll see on the second line. Kotzrin mipnei hanetios umipnei beis ha'ovel umipnei beis hamedrash. So even though the Torah prohibits cutting down the grains, the new grains from this crop, before you've reaped the grains, the barley for the Omer, but nevertheless, if the reason you're cutting down grains, the new crop, is because of a mitzvah, like, for example, in the case of netios, if there are grains growing in close proximity to the netios, which is a combination of peros elon with um, uh, with tvua, that is kilayim, and therefore you have to remove the wheat or the grains so as to avoid kilayim. Or in the case of Beis Ovel or Beis Hamedrash, where they needed more space in the outdoor area, so they had to cut down the grains in order to set up chairs for the Beis Ovel, meaning for the Sudas Havra, or for the Beis Hamedrash, for the Talmidim to sit on chairs. So my timer, what's the source in the Torah to differentiate between a, shall we call it a mundane, secular um, uh, reaping of a ktsira and a ktsira shel mitzvah? How do we know to differentiate between the two? Ktsirchem omar achmona v'lo ktsir mitzvah. The Torah says that you should cut down that harvest for the purpose of the minchas haomer in ktsirchem, which means that on a pshuta shel mikra level, it means it's your reaping, it's your harvest for the sake of the omer, but we're darshaning it to mean that the Torah is prohibiting any ktsirchem that's done for your own purpose before the ktsir of the omer, before the omer is cut down. But if it's a ktsir mitzvah and you're not doing the ktsir for your purpose, then it's mutter. The Mishnah says, "V'lo yasa krichos aval menichem tzvasim." So, in other words, if you make bundles, then don't tie up the bundles. So whenever we give a heter, a special permission, allowing you, for the sake of a mitzvah, to cut down the grains before you've cut down the grain for the omer, then we're going to limit that heter, and we're going to establish that you can only do what's absolutely necessary. But if you're going to do too much and you're going to be involved in the grains, and keep in mind these grains are usur midin chadash in consumption, then we're afraid you might come to consume it. And that's what the Gemara says now. My time to come lo tarchinon. We want to limit your availability, your involvement in the mitzvah. I'm sorry, in the preparation of these and the cutting down of this reaping for the sake of a mitzvah. The Mishnah says, "Mitzvah ha'omer lahavi min hakama." Kama means that it's not been harvested; it's still standing in its growth position on the ground, and as long as it's attached to the ground, then you could do the ktsira for the sake of the mitzvah of cutting down the barley for the omer, and we want lishma in the mitzvah. So that's called mitzvah lahavi min hakama. However, although that's the mitzvah, meaning that's the ideal way of doing the mitzvah, it's not essential, which means if you only have an omrim, which means it's all the barley that's available right now for the omer is already cut down, so it wasn't cut down with l'shem mitzvah. Nevertheless, it's kosher to use the omrim, to the cut down kernels. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa. Ve'im takriv minchas bikurim. So these are extra words in the Torah. Ma Talmud lomar. Why is the Torah adding this? We already have it. It says in the Torah, V'im takriv minchas bikurim lashem aviv kalui ba'esh gerish karmel. And then again it says the second time, takriv es minchas bikurecha. So these last words, the im takriv minchas bikurecha, are completely redundant. They're a repetition. Lefishem mitzvah sa'omer lahavi min hakama minayin shim lo matzah min hakama yavi min ha'omrim. As we said before, how do we know that even though it was cut down, these barley grains, the kernels were cut down, shalol l'shem mitzvah, you could still use them as omrim? Talmud Lomer, that's the extra word takriv. So takriv becomes a ribui to include even omrim. Dover acher, we're going to learn something else from takriv. Takriv lefisha mitzvah lahavi min alach. So what we do is we go out to the fields that surround Yerushalayim in order to cut down the barley, and that means that there won't be a lapse of time for the transportation from far away, and therefore, since it's close by, it'll be lach, it'll be very moist and fresh. What happens if they can't bring it in a way that they'll have it still moist? It's going to get dried. How do we know that they can still use that for the minchas ha'omer Talmud Lomer takriv? So this is another drasha that we derive from the extra word takriv l'rabos, even yavesh. I would like to insert the following comment. I don't know if I'm right about this, that yavesh means up to a certain point. Like, for example, at the beginning of the third parak of Sukkot, it says lulav hayavesh. If a lulav is totally dry, such that you put your nail and it on the lulav and it just crumbles in front of your eyes, then that's not considered a lulav at all. And here also, I doubt if it could be yavesh to that point. But yavesh means it's not moist, and that's not the way you should really do it. Another Josh from takriv is lefishim mitzvah liksar b'layla minayin shem niksar b'yom kosher. So the Ksiras HaOmer, as opposed to the Havas HaOmer, is done on the night going into the 16th of Nisan. How do we know that if they didn't cut down the Omer on the night of the 16th, they could still cut down the Omer on the day of the 16th and it'll still be valid? Tamaloma takriv, again, another ribui from the word takriv. And vidocha es hashavos, that if we delay, not deliberately, but if it happened to be that it was delayed from the ktsira, from the night till the day, then we could still, and now it's an overlap of Shabbos on the 16th of Nisan, so you could still cut down the Omer for the purpose of the Hakrovas Omer on the day of Shabbos. And we're going to soon see that Lafuke, you don't have to cut it down on Erev Shabbos in order to avoid Dechia Shabbos. Tamalol Takriv. So we're going to derive that from the word Takriv. So Takriv teaches us many different things. For example, you could bring it from Omrim, you could bring it on Yovesh, you could bring it even if it's Lila, and even it's Docha Shabbos. Furthermore, the Brisa says Takriv Kol Shehu, Takriv Mikol Makom, Takriv Afil V'Shabbos, Takriv Afil B'Tum. So the Brisa adds another point over here that even in a state of Tumah, you're allowed to bring the Omer if necessary. Again, if all things are equal, we want it to be Tar, but if you have no fallback position for Tar, you don't have possibly then the fallback position is to bring it even Tameh. And the reason for that probably is because there's a halacha of ritzui tzitz. But you know what? I would make the following qualification. I'm just talking to myself out loud, that ritzui tzitz only applies when the carbon itself is tameh. But here we're talking about takriv afilu b'tuma, even if the kohanim would contract tuma, and normally they can't be makriv a carbon, but the extra takriv is going to teach us that you bring the omer even if the Kohen is in a state of tumah. So that has nothing to do with the tzitz. And also, even if the 16th of Nisan overlaps with Shabbos, we'll bring it on Shabbos. Now, Niktzar Bayom, the Mishnah says kosher. Now we're going to quote a Mishnah in Megillah. Now, the Mishnah Megillah differentiates between two categories of mitzvos that are dependent on time, they're time sensitive. There are mitzvos haksheres bayom, and there are mitzvos haksheres balayla. And whenever you have a category of ksher bayom, then you cannot fulfill that mitzvah balayla, and vice versa. So Vatnan, the Mishnah says, kol alayla kosher l'ktziras ha'omer. And the rule of thumb, when we understand that Mishnah Megillah, is that when it says the mitzvah laila, it means lafuke to the exclusion of yom. Lahaktir chalovim vevarim. Once again, even though the shechita of the carbon was done during the day, but the haktoras haimurim of chalovim and evarim could be done through the following night until the following daybreak on the second day after the Hakrovas HaKarbon, because then it becomes Nosar. But Zeh Klal, what's the rule of thumb in interpreting the Mishnah in Megillah? Davish mitzvah bayom, kosher kol yom. Davish mitzvah balayla, kosher kol alayla. So it means that this is the equation between Lila and Yom. That which is Yom and not Lila. That which is Lila and not Yom. Ktani Lila, dumya Yom. Ma Yom, Balayla lo. Just like a mitzvah of Yom, you cannot fulfill it Balayla. And so too, after Lila Bayom, Nami lo. A mitzvah that is dedicated to the night cannot be implemented during the day. And if that be the case, then when it comes to Ksiras HaOmer, the Mishnah in Megillah says, Kol alayla kosher l'Ksiras HaOmer, means that Ksiras HaOmer is at night. And if that be the case, applying this principle, it cannot be during the day. And that's against the Brisa that we just learned, because the Brisa that we just learned established that from the extra word takriv, we're going to learn afilu bayom, that even on the 16th you could bring it. So how do we reconcile this contradiction? By the way, when it says here in the Mishnah in Megillah, it says Davar mitzvaso bayom is mitzvaso kol hayom. We're talking about the four avodos of a hakravas carbon, the shechita, for example, and so forth, culminating in zrikas hadam. That also has to be done by day. In fact, there's a principle that we had in the past called dam nifsal b'shkiyas hachama. Once the sun sets, there's no possibility of doing a zrika of dam, even if the shechita was done by day. But certainly there's no shechita by night. In any event, Omar Rabba lo kasha. How do we reconcile this? Ha Rebbe v'ha Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon. So this is very, very important for us for the entire daf that we're going to learn today, Mitzvah Shem. Rebbe holds that you can have a hakrovas ha'omer by day. Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon, apparently following in the footsteps of Rabbi Akiva, who was the Rebbe of his father Reb Shimon, there's no such thing as Omer, as the Ktsiras HaOmer by day, because applying the principle that we saw in the Mishnah Megillah, anything that's kosher balayla, mitzvos balayla, is eino kosher bayom. You can't bring it, fulfill it during the day. So that since on the list of the Mishnah opens with harvesting the Omer, the Ketzira of the Omer has to be by night, therefore it cannot be by day. And that's indeed the Shita of Rabbi Lazar. Tisanya, we learned in the Brisa, Haya Omeru Makriv Minchas HaOmer V'nitmes. What do we do in a case where the carbon became Tameh, in this case the Omer became Tameh, and we could bring the carbon Betuma, we're not excited about it, so therefore the Brisa says in Yesh Acheres, if when they bring this Omer and they realize the Omer was Makabel Tuma, they can find another grain, another kernel of barley to make the Omer, is then Omer Lo, the Bezdin who's in charge supervising the Avodas HaMikdash, will tell this fellow who's bringing the Omer Betuma, and he say to him, Have Acheres Tachtel, go out and find a substitute so we get this right and we do it the way it was meant to be done, and that is with Betara, Vim Lav. But let's say the man says, I'm sorry, but I can't find any barley that would be fit for the Omer, except for something that's Tameh. Is Omer Lo, Havi Pikeach. You're a very smart guy, and therefore you understand very well that we have no choice. In this situation, we have to bring the Omer B'tumah, but shtok, don't publicize it. Because you start publicizing, people will come to the conclusion that when it comes to a carbon tzibur, you could always bring a B'tumah. And that's not necessarily so. All this is Divrei Rebbe. So Rebbe holds that even though the Omer was Tameh, you could bring it B'tumah. Rabbi Lezer, Reb Shimon Omer, on the other hand, Beikach ubenkach Omer lo havi pikeach u'shesok, shekol ha'omer sheniktzah shelo k'mitzvos posel. So Rabbi Lezer, Reb Shimon says that whenever the Torah requires the following requirement for the Omer, let's say, for example, it has to be B'tahara, or it has to be Balayla, the Ketzir has to be Balayla, then that's the way it has to be. And there's no fallback position. It's going to be possible if it's Tameh. And you cannot do the Ktsiras HaOmer by day. It's got to be by night. And therefore, we're always going to tell him that if that's all he has, then there's nothing we could do to salvage the Omer. In other words, there's no such thing just one second. I'm going to read to you the language he has here. Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon holds that the various details of the Omer offering, such as harvesting the barley at night, are essential to its validity. The omer may not be brought under any circumstances if it was harvested by day. There's no other option. Ah, so now I understand. Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, and Rebbe are arguing about the following scenario. We have two possibilities. We could be makriv the omer b'tuma, or we could go out to the fields and reap barley b'tara. And herein lies the controversy between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Elazar Reb Shimon. According to Rebbe, that which we require, for example, that the reaping of the omer should be done at night, that's only lechatchila, but it's not essential. Therefore, in an event that we could fulfill the mitzvah of the omer in its most perfect form, and not betuma, but rather betara, we would have to now go out to the fields on the 16th in order to reap a minchas haomer betara. Then that's exactly what we have to do. According to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, we don't have that option because Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon holds that since the Torah requires that the Ketzira be done at night, it can only be done at night. And if you're going to go out now for the sake of trying to find an Omer B'Tara and you're going to cut down kernels of barley, those kernels of barley cannot be valid for the Omer. And therefore, go ahead and be makriv the Omer B'Tumah. And the fact that you could be makriv the omer b'tuma is derived from that extra pasuk takriv, as we saw earlier. Okay. Now, how does Rabbi Elazar come to his conclusion that whatever the Torah requires for the omer, like for example, that the ketzira should be done at night, it's essential? Omer Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Shitas Rabbi Kiva Rabbi Shal Aviv Amra. So the Rebbe of Rabbi Elazar's father, like for example, my father's Rebbe was Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, so he would be the Rebbe of my father. So the Rebbe of Rabbi Elazar's father, meaning Rav Shimon, was Rabbi Akiva, and therefore Rabbi Elazar was sort of, shall we say, committed to follow in the footsteps of Rabbi Akiva. This Nana we learned in a Mishnah. And this is a Mishnah at the end of Maseches Shabbos. It says, "Klal Omer Rebbe Akiva, Kol Malach Shev Shelo Lasos Erev Shabbos, Ein Adoches HaShabbos." So according to Rabbi Akiva, even though the Torah allows you to violate the Shabbos for mitzvah X, like for example for Milah, and therefore we should go one step further and establish that anything that's necessary in order to fulfill that mitzvah should override the Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva nevertheless says, wait a minute, could you have done this Erev Shabbos? And if you could do it on Erev Shabbos, we're not going to override the Shabbos. That's point number one. V'savar lo ki Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon also holds like the principle of Rabbi Yishmael, the Omer Ktsiras HaOmer Mitzvah. And this is based on a Mishnah Masechtes Shvius, which records a machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva as to how to interpret the pasuk Becharish uvekotzir Tishbos, a pasuk in Shmos Perek Lamed Daled. It's not. Rabbi Shmuel Omer Ma Chorish Rishus Af Kotzer Rishus Yotza Ktsira Omer Shehi Mitzvah. So even though Ktsira is one of the 39 malachas, nevertheless, the Torah only prohibits something that's similar to Chorish. And Chorish is, which means plowing, which is used as a prototype of that which is Rishus. Right? We don't do Charish of mitzvah, we do Charish of Rishus. It's like the Gemara Maseches about Chotev Eitzim is Rishus. Okay. And that's coming to exclude a case of Ktsira Shal Mitzvah, which is permissible on Shabbos. And why is Ktsira Omer permissible on Shabbos? Because it's a Ktsira Shal Mitzvah. And it's not similar to Charish. Charish means Rishus. Okay, so now we're going to combine A plus B. On the one hand, we're accepting the principle of Rabbi Akiva that which could be done before Shabbos is not Docha Shabbos. On the other hand, we're accepting the principle of Rabbi Shmuel that Ktsiras HaOmer is a mitzvah. Ve'isal kedaitach niktzar shalo kemitzvah so kosher. If you're going to tell me that although the Torah in an ideal lechatchila situation would require that the ktsira be done at night, but that's not essential. It's very nice that you would stay within the box and you would do the ktsira at night, but that's not necessary, meaning it's not essential. If that be the case, then the Ktsiras Omer should be done or can be done on Erev Shabbos. And if it can be done on Erev Shabbos, since Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon accepts the principle of Rabbi Akiva, then it's not Docha Shabbos. And we know that the Ktsiras Omer is Docha Shabbos. And that we know from Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah Shvius that Charish is Rishus, but Kotzer is not Rishus, it's mitzvah, and therefore it's Docha Shabbos. How can it be Docha Shabbos if you accept Rabbi Akiva's principle that anything that can be done before Shabbos is not Docha Shabbos? And now we're holding that anything that was Niktzar, even Shalom K'mitzvaso, is kosher, so therefore he could have done the Ktsira on Erev Shabbos. So how could you, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, maintain Rabbi Shmuel's position that Ktsira Omer is Docha Shabbos, Shma Mina? Therefore, we have to conclude, right? Amai Dochi Shabbos Nixor Erev Shabbos Elomi Dochi Shabbos. Since we know that Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon accepted the principle of Rabbi Shmuel that Ktsiras HaOmer as a mitzvah is Docha Shabbos, then Shmamina Nixor Shalok Mitzvah Apostle, meaning that Ktsira on Erev Shabbos is not even an option. Why? Because whenever the Torah requires limitzvaso, then that's the way it has to be done, and it cannot be valid any other way. And since we know that the Ktsira has to be done by Laila, therefore it cannot be done by Yom. It cannot be done on Erev Shabbos, can't be done on Shabbos. And not only that, since it cannot be done at any other time, therefore it's Docha Shabbos. Because again, we're accepting Rabbi Akiva's principle that if it could be done before Shabbos, then it's not Docha Shabbos. And yet we know that Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon agrees, based on Rabbi Shmuel, that the Ktsiras Omer is Docha Shabbos. It's not Rishus. So we come to the conclusion now, just summarizing the bottom line, is that according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, if the Torah requires that the Ktsira be at night, it has to be by night. And therefore, going back to his machlokus against Rebbe, in a case where the Omer is Tameh, we don't have the option, according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, of going out on the 16th to the fields in order to replace the Omer that's Tameh with Omer with barley that's Tahor. That's not an option, because since the Torah requires that the Shechita, that the Ktsira be at night, it has to be by night. And there is no option of doing a Ktsira by day. So now the Gemara wants to know one thing. Where does Rebbe fit into this whole thing? Isn't Rebbe also committed to accept Rabbi Akiva? For Rebbe Lavmi, Talmid of Reb Shimon, who Rebbe is also a Talmud of Reb Shimon, and Reb Shimon in turn is a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, and therefore Rebbe should likewise be committed to accept the view of Rabbi Akiva. And if we accept the view of Rabbi Akiva, then how could it be that Ksiras Homer is Docha Shabbos when the halacha is that anything that could be done on Erev Shabbos is not Docha Shabbos? Shahinu Lemedim, Omer Rebbe Shahinu Lemedim Torah, Eitzel Rebbe Shimon, B'Tkoa. Very good. There was a place called Tekoa. Maybe it's the same Tekoa as today, I don't know. And that's where Rebbe used to study at the feet of Reb Shimon. And Ayinu Malim Lo Shemin Valuntis Michotza Legag, Umigag Lekarpif, Karpif Lekarpif Acher, She'ad Shanu Magim Lemayon, She'anu Rochtzim Bo. Okay, so this is a whole sugya in Masechta Shabbos and in Masechta Erevin about the possibility of carrying through a Rishus HaRabim, and Rabbi Shimon's Talmidim would carry his bath items out to the spring, and they would wend their way through a series of contiguous private domains. So in order to avoid carrying a Rishus HaRabim. Fine. Okay, this is not for us. Anyway, we see one thing from this brisa, that Rebbe was a disciple of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon was a disciple, we know, of Rabbi Akiva. If that be the case, then how could Rebbe allow you to override the Shabbos in the case of Ktsiras HaOmer in order to replace the Omer that was Tameh with fresh and pure, uncontaminated barley sheaves? How could he allow that when it could have been done on Erev Shabbos? So now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a statement of Rabbi Shimon, who again is the Rebbe of Rebbe, in order to justify violating the Shabbos and cutting down the Omer during the day in order to replace the Omer that was Tameh. And this is the principle called Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. I'll give an example of that principle. Let's say, for example, Ola Shabbos b'Shabbato, you have a korban Ola on Shabbos, which is Docha Shabbos, but the Aktoras Imurim could be done Motzi Shabbos, because Aktoras Imurim is always kosher the night after. So you don't have to violate the Shabbos by putting the Imurim on the Mizbeach and burning them. But the answer is no. Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. We want to do the mitzvah in its proper time, and if that be the case, we're going to even override the Shabbos. So again, since it's possible, if need be, to bring the Omer from Betuma, why does Rebbe allow you to go out to the fields on Shabbos, reap the harvest in order to get to Tara? Because Rebbe holds that even though lechatchila the Torah wanted the reaping of the Omer to be at night, but it can be during the day. But how can you do that? Because Rebbe has to be committed to the Shita of his Rebbe's Rebbe, meaning Rebbe Akiva, that it's not necessary to be Docha Shabbos, and therefore it's not Docha Shabbos, we could bring a Betumah. So Savar Lucky Idach Rabbi Shimon, the Sanya Rabbi Shimon, Borei Kamal Chaviva, Mitzvah Shait Sharei Hektir, Chalav Levarim Ksherim Kol Laila, V'lo Yamamtin Lemanat Shetechsha. Even though he could burn the Chalav and Ivarim at night after Shabbos is over without violating the Shabbos, nevertheless will violate the Shabbos. And why is that? Because Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. So too in the case of the Omer. And it's true that the Omer could what? Could have been cut down before Shabbos. Because again, according to Rebbe, that which we require the Omer to be cut down on Leil Tesvav, that's only Limitzvaso, but it's not Likuva, and the possibility exists that you could cut down the harvest the night before Tesvav without violating the Shabbos, and we're holding that anything that can be done before the Shabbos is not Docha Shabbos. But the answer is Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. And since Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita, which means that the real time that the Torah wants for the cutting down of the Omer is at night, and therefore we're going to violate the Shabbos.